And I'm very delighted to have Dr. Sharlene Newman with us. Dr. Newman, Sharlene is a really dear colleague and friend who has shaped my learning trajectory in the language sciences, and likely those of many of our colleagues. Some of us are here with us today. Sharlene is an expert by any means in MRI methodology and its applications to understand the functional and structural underpinnings of language processing, neurocognitive functions, including language and healthy aging, and bilingualism. Sharlene has widely published in the field, and her work has been supported by the NIH and the NSF. As some of you know, Sharlene came to Penn State many years ago. And in this case, I remember it's many years ago when I was a young postdoctoral researcher at Penn State, and Jorge was there too, to that extent. Sharlene came to health when Penn State just opened the Neuroimaging Center. Sharlene was one of the selected MRI specialists who came to us for a couple of months and taught us the basis of MRI methodology to study language and bilingualism. Sharlene, we cannot thank you enough for that help back then. Sharlene is also a strong advocate for inclusion and diversity in science, especially during these times. Thank you, Sharlene, for being such a voice. To this date, I speak for myself here, but I think other people agree. You are one of the most valuable colleagues and mentors I have. Sharlene has recently transitioned from the University of Indiana at Bloomington, where she was the director of the program in neuroscience and professor in psychology and brain sciences. Sharlene is currently professor of psychology and electrical and computer engineering, and the executive director of the Alabama Life Research Institute at the University of Alabama. So we are really close. We calculated yesterday maybe 6 or 7, 8 hours by car. Well, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Sharlene Newman, who will talk today about the neuroscience of language, other language-specific processing modules. Thank you, Sharlene. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for that introduction. Like Eleonora said, I've known a couple of you for a long time. I'm going to see if I can add my PowerPoint and share it with the screen. You guys can't see that. Let's see. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes, okay. Now, do you see like the actual PowerPoint, or do you see, okay, because I have two monitors and I don't know which one you see.
You're good.
Okay.
That's great, yep.
I only see half though, but it might be my options. Let's see, zoom ratio, fit to window, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oops, let me move. Anyway, so we'll get started. So I think one of the things I wanted to talk about, and in some ways I sort of beat myself up a little because I was like, oh, well, I'll tell Eleonora I'm going to do something that I don't actually have a PowerPoint, a presentation already prepared for, sort of force me to think about some things and put something down on paper. But of course, when it got closer to time to do this presentation, I was like, oh shoot, now I actually have to put together the presentation. But these are some things that I've been thinking about for a long time, and that is this localization debate. So any of you guys who are, I mean, we've all sort of heard this debate about whether or not language has these sort of modules that are encapsulated and whether or not they're language-specific brain processing regions. And so I wanted to just spend some time talking about that and give you my thoughts on that. I think in order to really understand like my thoughts on that, it's probably important to also get a sense of like who I am and where I came from. So it probably felt a little strange to hear Eleonora say that I'm faculty in psychology and electrical and computer engineering. They don't necessarily go together. but for me, they do. So I'm trained as an engineer. I'm not trained as a linguist. I'm trained as an engineer. My PhD is in biomedical engineering. And my focus there was medical imaging. So that's who I am, and that's how I came to cognitive neuroscience. But that also means that my training has also sort of influences how I think about this work. So that's just a part of it, and you'll probably see it kind of coming through a little. I don't think about it anymore because it's just how I think. But I did want to talk a little bit about localization and how we got to where we are, and how we think about the brain and how language is organized. And so in some ways, the fathers of localization were language, or sort of are created the foundation for how we think about language, and that's like Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke, right? So their work sort of laid this foundation of us thinking about language as being in these very sort of specific regions of the brain, and we think about Broca's area being involved in production and syntax, and Wernicke's and meaning, and they sort of laid the groundwork for that a little. A figure that hasn't got the attention that he probably deserves is Bastian. And so he came after them, but he studied one particular patient, Thomas A, for 18 years. And what I think is interesting about him is that he didn't necessarily sort of buy into this strict kind of localizationist ideas, right? So he talked about networks. He talked about the distributed nature of functional architecture. He clearly, discussed things in terms of more of the sort of psychological functions and not anatomical, right? In those kinds of ways. So instead of referring to the, Broca's area as Broca's area, he talked about it in terms of this glossokinesthetic center, right? And so, yes, he's still in some ways talking about localization, but what he's localizing may be slightly different. Right? And he did influence some of the people that we sort of think about today and the models that we still use today. But somehow, I think the way he thought about localization and language kind of got lost a little. And some of that, I think, is because of the work of Chomsky and Fodor and Pinker, right? And so this idea of language being innate leads to this idea of modularity, leads to this idea of language being special and separate from other aspects of cognition. And so it kind of naturally leads to this idea that there are these language specific processing modules that's separate from the rest of cognition, right? And so there's been a lot of sort of this long history, and I guess it's not that long compared to, but there's this history of us sort of being entrenched in this idea of language being special, and then which has led to this whole debate about, no, it's not special, yes, it is special, no, which in some ways kind of distorts how we can think about what's actually going on. And so I put here in the slides this nice review that talks about modularity in a much sort of nicer way than I am. But it also sort of looks at this child development as well as adults. And I do recommend taking a look at this. It's a book chapter, but it's a really good discussion of this whole idea of modularity. But I also think that cognitive science, growing up with computer science, has also impacted how we think about the brain, right? And so we have this computer metaphor, and that metaphor has been great in some ways because it's pushed the science, but it's also limiting, right? Because our brains are not computers. Our brains don't work the way computers work. And the cognitive models that were developed are not necessarily biologically plausible. But that has not stopped us from trying to put those models onto brain structure, which I think is what's limiting, right? So for example, we still think about Baddeley's working memory model as being something that's in our brain. It's not. There's no buffer sitting that's pushing information into some buffer like a computer. That's not how the brain works. And Baddeley is very open in saying that, no, it's not. But we still want to do that. We want to equate our brain imaging data with these cognitive models that aren't biologically plausible, which again pushes us into thinking about modularity. And modularity in the way that these cognitive models think about modularity, right? In terms of, you have a syntax processing region and a semantic processing, or you, in the case of working memory, you have this rehearsal mechanism here, and you have this buffer, phonological buffer here, and you have a visual spatial sketch pad, which is like this, you know, empty space that you can draw on. I mean, these are these metaphors that are interesting. I mean, they help you think about things, but they can also be limiting if you actually are looking for the biological analog to the visual spatial sketch pad, right? And so I think these are the problems, that in some ways get in the way of us thinking about our brain data in maybe a different way. And so this is an example, right? So again, neuroimagers keep chasing these cognitive models, right? And so this is from a review from Kathy Price in 2010, where she looked at 100 fMRI studies of speech comprehension and production. And you see here these cognitive labels sort of stuck on this brain, right? So word selection is here. And then the question for me becomes, what do you mean by words? I mean, what is this region doing for word selection? How is, like, there are a lot of processes involved in word selection. Which process is here? All of them? Like, what's going on? But we keep trying to do this. And so the question becomes, does this even make sense? Or what's the next step to move beyond this to think about how language is actually processed in the brain? Those are the kinds of questions that I've been kind of wrestling with, and how you do that. Now, I want to say, you know, that it's not that I don't believe in localization, and I'll sort of get to that in a minute, but the question is, what's localized? So just to give you the spoiler alert, I don't think language is special. It's no different than any other cognitive process. It's no more innate than other sort of higher level cognitive processes. And I personally don't think that there's language specific processing modules. I don't. So that's what we'll sort of spend time talking about. And I'm okay with you guys jumping in and asking questions, because I can talk fast and I can be done with this presentation in like 15 minutes. Even though that's not my plan, but I can be, because I can sort of fly through it. So I'm going to use the inferior frontal gyrus as a case, right? And this is the thing that you'll sort of find about most, if not all, neuroimagers. We all have our favorite brain region. My favorite brain region is the inferior frontal gyrus. It has been since the beginning. And that's my favorite region. So that's what we're going to talk about. My favorite brain region, the inferior frontal gyrus. So it does encompass Broca's area. I mean, how Broca's area is defined depends on who you ask. I include BA 44, 45, and 47 in Broca's area. Everyone doesn't include 47. I include 47. So all of those regions. And you see here in the schematic that I sort of just showed, that includes this articulatory planning, hierarchical sequencing, word selection, and semantic constraint. So these processes based on this model, this language model, are involved in the inferior frontal gyrus. Sort of does these types of processing. And this is a figure from a paper, meta-analysis of working memory. Not just verbal working memory, but also nonverbal working memory. So this is working memory. And you see that it sort of links different, maybe overlapping processes to the same regions, right? I can't see it on that screen. So BA45 or pars triangularis, according to the working memory literature, is involved in proactive interference, post-retrieval selection, selective refreshing, right? So that's a little different than word selection. And this again is both verbal and nonverbal working memory. So these are the processes that are involved in working memory in this region. And parts of percularis of BA44, you have subvocal rehearsal, which is analogous to this articulatory planning, task activation, dual tasking, selective attention, right? So when you take a look at another cognitive domain and look in the same brain region, you get a different set of processes that are linked to this region, right? So what does that mean? To me, it means there's no way that this is language specific if tasks that don't involve language activated. Now, the pushback that I always get is that, oh, you know, language is involved in all non-linguistic things too, because we think in terms of language and languages. You know, that's just, I don't buy that, just because, I mean, in that case, then language is everything and everything is like, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. So I just sort of, no. And that's not true for everyone. Everyone doesn't think in language. I mean, I do. I mean, I have a running dialogue in my head all the time, but other people don't. And so, no. So, but looking across different cognitive domains, you see overlap, right? And so, another example, I guess another thing about me that that is also important is yes, I study language, but I don't know if it's because, you know, maybe I have a little ADHD or something, but I get bored and then I study like lots of other things as well. I do not necessarily recommend it for your career to be sort of spread out as I am. But you know, I will work with almost anybody. And so I also do quite a bit of work in the area of problem solving. And so here's some data from 2 problem solving tasks. One is the Tower of London. So this is activation from a visual spatial planning task, the Tower of London. There's no language involved in this task, but you still see activation in the inferior frontal gyrus, right? And so, you know, so what, and in this case, in the area that, according to the language sort of model, is related to articulatory rehearsal. But there's no articulation other than fingers, because you're moving the balls around and clicking buttons, but there's no verbal rehearsing or articulation. This one is a verbal reasoning task. So there is verbal, but this is a comparison between around difficulty. And you still see this activation in another part of the inferior frontal gyrus, but still in the inferior frontal gyrus, right? So again, even when you're not looking at language processing, you're still seeing activation in language processing regions. So again, the question becomes, and again, I'm not saying that there isn't any localization, it's just not language specific processes, right? So then the question becomes, well, how can we define what these processes are? I personally think the only way you're going to do that is to look across different cognitive domains and see what tasks activate the region and what's common, what process is common across those that could potentially be related to what's going on. And I don't think looking at just language processing is going to tell us what's going on in inferior frontal gyrus, given that all these non-linguistic tasks activate the inferior frontal gyrus. So one possible sort of process that we could link to at least one part of Broca's area is sequential processing, right? So there is some proposal that sequential cognition, which is this ability to extract and use sequential structure, is really important to syntactic processing. We know this, so I mean, there's a lot of movement that happens, you know, order matters, so syntactic processing is sequential processing. And so what you're seeing here is activation from looking at syntactic complexity, where you see activation. Again, I mean, it overlaps nicely with that language network, where this superior sort of posterior part of IFG was labeled as sequential or sequence hierarchy or sequential hierarchy. You're seeing that activation here for syntactic complexity. You're also seeing it here for sequential finger tapping. So this is a sequential finger tapping task that one of my former graduate students did in the lab, and you see the region overlaps. So it's not language specific, it's sequential processing that gets recruited when you're doing syntactic processing that requires sequential processing, right? So it's not, so again, there's likely localization, and I do believe that there is localization, but the question is always what is being localized. And here's another example looking at still finding activation in inferior frontal gyrus. Now, you know, this is when viewing American Sign Language and Spanish stimuli, but the stimuli were presented to people who did not know sign language or Spanish, right? And their task was to just determine whether or not the sign was made on the face or whether or not the Spanish word required the lips to close, right? So that they just said yes if the sign was made on the face and no otherwise, or yes if the lips closed and no otherwise. They didn't know the language, either of the languages. And you still get this activation in inferior frontal gyrus, right? So it's not language. We argue that it's about segmenting this stimulus and being able to sort of respond to that question, but it's not language. But we're still seeing this activation. And just so that you're aware, I mean, this was part of a longitudinal study. So this is time point 1, and then we waited a semester after they had taken Spanish or ASL and scanned them again to see how the activation changed. And, you know, the activation did change and became more language-like after a semester. Okay, so this is just time point 1. So we're not just doing this just to look at what's going on in inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so, you know, just an interim summary. So again, there is localization of function, but how do you define the function? I don't think it should be necessarily defined in terms of language processes. The same way Bastian didn't define it in terms of language processing. So I think it also argues for studying all of cognition because language isn't special. And in some ways, in order to really understand how language works, we need to understand how it works in relation to all of cognition, right? So it's not a separate cognitive process. It's just a part of cognition. And we know that cognition influences language, and language influences other cognitive processes. We see that in disorders. So there are like a number of disorders that are not necessarily characterized by language deficits, but that have language deficits, right? At least we don't necessarily think about them as being a language disorder. So like schizophrenia, for example, one of the primary characteristics is disorganized language, right? So prosody is impacted, and just how they organize speech and metaphorical language comprehension is impacted in schizophrenia. Autism, there are language problems associated with autism, but we don't think about autism as being a language disorder. Dementia, it impacts language processing, but we don't think about dementia as being a language disorder. So these cognitive processes, they're all interacting and they're all dependent upon each other. So to think about language as being some isolated, encapsulated module, in a lot of ways, just doesn't fit the data at all. Okay. So I do want to talk a little bit about individual differences and sort of begin with the dynamics of activation. I'm not quite sure how this is going to fit, but I mean, I sort of am a huge advocate for taking a look at individual differences. So I kind of always try to throw it in a talk. So I'm going to talk a little about it. So starting with this, the dynamics, and really all I want to say here is that, and this is something we all know, right? Especially you guys who use EEG. I mean, you know that this activation unfolds over time, right? So the processing of words, the processing of sentences, I mean, it all unfolds over time. But I think the big part to also remember is that processes come on board, get recruited as they're needed, right? So, and sometimes you forget that when you're looking at fMRI, because you don't have the same temporal resolution. But even in the fMRI data, depending on what you're doing, you still see that the recruitment of that brain regions are coming online when they're needed, not from the beginning of your stimulus presentation, but when they're needed in the course of processing. And so this is like what my first study as a postdoc. We did this verbal reasoning task, and we presented the problem one phrase at a time. And you see here, and again, it's not, the point is not to get into the details of the study, but just to show that in some regions, you don't see any difference between the two conditions during the first phrase, and then the second phrase come and you see sort of the split in the activation. Why? Because that region, it requires more work for that region during that second part. In other regions, you don't necessarily see those differences. And so different regions are coming on and off at different times, depending on when they're and how they're needed. So that's just something important, I think, to remember. Because again, sometimes they can get lost if you're not looking at your time courses, because it's still there with fMRI, depending on your task and how you're analyzing your data or presenting your stimuli even. So individual differences. So I guess, again, a little background about me. So one of the reasons why I became interested in language processing to begin with is because I was fascinated with individual differences, in this case, individual differences in learning to read, even though that's not necessarily what I studied, specifically, at least not in the beginning. And that is because, I have 3 siblings. The first 3 of us are all like a year apart. Well, the first 2 of us are all a year apart. I'm still going 4. So I'm the oldest, and I have a sister who's a year younger than me and a brother who's a year younger than her. They could both read better than I could. In elementary school, they could both read. I mean, it was bad, and I was in remedial reading for a couple years before they let me out. But I was very aware that I read different than they did. Right? Very aware that how I learned to read was different. How I read is different. Like, I can't sound out words. They can sound out words. This is like a long time ago, so no one was being diagnosed with dyslexia, but I still can't sound out words. So I got out of remedial reading once I memorized enough words. And so I could fake that I could read like everybody else. Right? And so, you always wonder, like, well, how come they can read better than I can read? Like, what is wrong with me? I was good at math, and so, I was better than them in math, so it kind of evened out. But that was the thing. And so, when you think about individual differences, and there are a number of factors that impact language processing and how language is processed. So we each process language slightly different, because it depends on the resources that you have available. Like, you will read something differently depending on what else you're doing or how hard what you're reading is, right? So if you're reading something that is unfamiliar, or you're just trying to perform the task, you'll read it differently than if you're reading for leisure. So how you read varies depending on why you're reading, and what else you're doing, right? So the resources that are available vary. And we've seen this in some of our studies of dual tasking, right? So we've done these studies of dual tasking where people are reading and doing something else, right? And so you see differences in the language network, depending on what kinds of resources are available. Even though task performance can stay relatively okay. It also varies depending on skill, ability, or experience, right? So whether working memory capacity, the presence of disorders like dyslexia, or whether you're a second language learner and you're reading in your second language, right? So how you read varies by lots of things. Even, we've done a study looking at degree of handedness, in this case, degree of right-handedness, and we see variance in the activation pattern that's because of that, right? So there are a lot of things that impact how you process language. And this is just some data from a study that we did back in 2013, looking at working memory capacity, in this case, using the reading span to measure working memory capacity and with object relative sentences. And you see that the precuneus, that activation is correlated with working memory capacity. Now this is going to come back again when we're talking about this particular brain region and the default mode network. I'm going to sort of bring that back up again. But this idea that potentially this region is modulating the resources that are available. This is not necessarily a region that we consider a language processing region, right? It's not one that we consider a classic language processing region, but it comes up a few times. We'll see today, it comes up a couple of times. And so what's going on? What is this region doing? How is it contributing to language processing? And then the last thing in terms of individual differences I want to talk about is strategy differences, right? Because I've gotten burned a couple of times by subjects performing the task in a way that I didn't expect them to perform the task. The nice thing is after the first time I started to debrief subjects all the time and just kind of ask them, like, what strategy did you use? How do you think you did the task? So that if I see some weird data, I can go back and take a look. I don't routinely take a look, but if I see something weird, I'll go back and take a look. And in this case, this is a sentence processing task, right? So they're presented with either a conjoined active or an object relative sentence. In this case, we put a delay between the sentence and the comprehension probe so that we can look at the activation for the sentence separate from the probe. And then they're presented with this comprehension probe, right? So, and I didn't even think about like what was going on until I was presenting some data in my graduate class. And one of the students had been a subject and he was like, oh, I didn't read the sentences. He's like, what do you mean you didn't read the sentences? I mean, how did you perform the task if you didn't read the sentences? He's like, I didn't read the sentences. I just memorized the order of the nouns and the verbs and then I could answer the question. And I was like, are you kidding me? So then I went back through the debriefings and he was not alone. About half of our subjects said that they used the same strategy. So I separated them based on that strategy, and lo and behold, you see these dramatic differences in brain activation, right? So particularly in BA44, right? So during the sentence phase, those who are like just remembering certain words are showing much more activation in BA44 than those who are actually reading the sentence. Right? And so it's like, what the heck is going on? Like, why would you come up with this? Of course, it's a shortcut so that they do less work, right? And so what we didn't have is enough information or enough subjects really to be able to go, okay, so which one of you are creating these strategies? Who's finding these strategies? What is it about you? My hypothesis is that those people with higher working memory capacities who have the capacity to be able to read the sentences and develop the strategy, the shortcut at the same time, are the ones who are developing these shortcuts. But you see it completely changes, it changes the activation It changes the activation pattern. And so it's something else you have to kind of think about. It also sort of means that, what does it mean to have a language network? If these things, all of these other cognitive processes can come in and alter it, it means it's not encapsulated. It's not sort of isolated from the rest of cognition. It's part of cognition. I mean, it's all the same thing. So, I mean, it's interesting to think about. You also see here, I mean, when I was doing my own analysis and doing this work, I mean, I always like to see time courses because, I don't know, I like to see time courses. But it was also cool to see, like, in inferior parietal cortex, you just really don't, it doesn't come online until the comprehension probe.
Excuse me, Sharlene, can I ask a question?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so I'm finding this actually really funny, but also that I do an awful lot with like cognitive predictors of language stuff, and it sounds to me more like it's verbatim memory rather than working memory. So if you were going to actually do the same thing again but do some cognitive tests, make sure you have your very basic digispan forward that
right.
So it has to be. And the other thing that comes to mind, there was an old book that, well, some of us here may remember, that came out of the San Diego group about small is better. I don't know if you remember that. It was the idea that if you have a small working memory, a small processing window, you will actually learn to process language better.
Oh.
Through a semantic syntactic route, rather than like these kids, which I bet have these enormous verbatim memories where they're just memorizing it.
Yeah, I completely agree, because one of the things that we wanted to do, but I don't think we ever got around to actually doing, I think there's a student who was going to do it, left the lab. But what I wanted to do was go, okay, so right, because it is verbatim memory. It's just remembering words in the order. It's not really comprehending anything. Right. But they could answer the question because the questions had the same words. Right. So then we wanted to, okay, so if we change the words in the comprehension probe so that they actually had to comprehend, then we would sort of completely disrupt the strategy. So
oh yeah.
We wanted to kind of play around with that some, but yeah.
Oh, right. And I, like do the first half of the experiment one way and then switch it on them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That,
yeah.
That's just very cool. So.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also, I think it's an example of this idea that humans are just missing. They're going to do what they're going to do. It doesn't matter what you tell them. If there's a shortcut to be found, there are going to be people who find it. If there's anything in your stimuli that will allow them to do something other than what you told them to do, they will do it.
Right. Except older adults. I don't know if you've done anything in aging, but
no,
they do what you tell them.
I haven't worked with them so much, but young adults, no.
Oh yeah. They're going to look for an out.
They're always looking for a shortcut. And in this case, half of them found it. And so I think, the thing to think about is that there are a number of cognitive factors that influence language processing. We all know this, right? So, but these factors impact the language network, right? It impacts the composition of that network and the dynamics of that network. So individual differences matter. I mean, we can't assume that because they're all 18-year-olds and in college that they're all processing the same way, because they're not. They're just not. So I think the last thing that I wanted to talk about is really a study that is all my graduate student, Yang Yu. So we were wanting to look at the dynamics of functional connectivity during sentence comprehension. That was what we, started. That's how it started. We wanted to try to do it with fMRI because, you see these sort of dynamic connectivity studies with resting state, and you're just like, okay, let's try to see if we can do this with functional data, well, task-based functional data. We couldn't get that to work. we could not get it to work. So then we were like, okay, so we'll instead we'll do EEG and source localization. EEG has a temporal resolution, and so we can do the dynamic functional connectivity with EEG data. So she began to do this, and she worked out source localization, and then COVID hit. So no more data. So that was that. But that's still something we're interested in doing, but we're not going to be able to get that done before she graduates because she's graduating in May. So this is a plug for Yang. She's graduating this spring. So instead, what Yang did was she took the fMRI data that she had and looked at it in a number of different ways. So here are her stimuli. The stimuli isn't as important as the imaging part that I'll talk about. But just so that you're aware, she looks at these 4 different sentence types, both subject and object modifying sentences, and they're all Chinese, and she's scanning Chinese native speakers. And so, and then she's looking at left branching and center embedded. And so again, these 4 sentence types, but again, that's not the important part here. So we first do the GLM, so the standard GLM analysis, and we get sort of these different activation sort of patterns, different regions sort of active and showing greater activation for the center embedded object relative compared to the subject modifying in more classic sort of language regions, but not the inferior frontal gyrus. We're not seeing activation there. And then the yellow is for the object modifying the center embedded greater than the left branching. And then you get this precuneus activation when comparing the left branching subject modifying and object modifying. So again, some not necessarily language E regions for some of these contrasts, and then language G regions for other contrasts. So the next thing that she did was to do a spatial ICA analysis with these data. And now you see a number of different networks that come up. And so the way this analysis worked is that she performed the ICA on the time series, and then correlate with the tissue, and so only looked at that's correlated with gray matter, and then sort of gets rid of everything that's correlated with white matter or CSF. Then you sort of project that back into SPM, and then you compare across your conditions. And so here you're seeing one of the components, ICA components, that shows greater differences between the center embedded object and subject modifying condition, right? And so the red here, I don't know how well you guys can see this. The red is the language network. So the language resting state network is what's red. The yellow is the positive component, and the blue is the negative component. And what you see is that there's nice overlap between the language network and the regions, the ICA sort of network that shows greater involvement for the object modifying center embedded compared to the subject modifying center embedded, which is very, similar in some ways to what we see here with the red. You're seeing temporal language network involvement there. Now you don't see the same thing for the left branching, but we didn't see the same thing for left branching and the GLM, right? And so in some ways the spatial ICA matches it, but you are seeing sort of more extensive network with the ICA than you do with the GLM. And everything here is corrected for multiple comparisons. So you don't have to worry about sort of that issue. But one of the other components that, I think that's really interesting is you get the default mode network that pops up as one of the components, that you see differences for the left branching object versus subject modifying condition, which is again analogous to what we see with the GLM, right? Because you see the precuneus, which is part of the default mode network in the GLM, you just don't see the whole network that you see when you do the ICA analysis. Now the question becomes, why are you seeing a difference between, again, because we talked before about seeing this precuneus region involved that's correlated with working memory capacity, and now we're seeing this default mode network, this precuneus engaged again. Again, this is not considered to be a language processing network, but it's involved in language processing. And again, we sort of hypothesize, and again, mostly Yang Yu, but I agree with her. Hypothesize that what the default mode network is doing is helping to sort of modulate attentional resources. And so that, that's what we are arguing that it's doing. So again, I think one of the points here is, how do you analyze your imaging data? What's the best way to do that? And I don't think there's an answer to that yet. I know sort of Vince Calhoun is sort of really pushing spatial ICA. And in this case, we're seeing what looks like some really cool results using spatial ICA that we weren't able to see using the GLM, right? But part of that is, I really hate family-wise error correction. Eleonora knows how much I hate family-wise error.
I know.
It wipes out so much activation. Even if you have an a priori sort of hypothesis that there should be activation there, it doesn't matter. And because of this whole sort of hoopla around this replication crises and people are like sort of crazy about statistics right now, which I guess is good. But anyway, I'm gonna leave that there. Then she did this network analysis, right? So this Olaf Sporn's-esque network analysis. So where you parcellate the brain into 200 different parcels. They typically don't include subcortical structure. So we're really just talking about the cortex. You perform your correlations and then you do your network analysis. And here's just looking at one particular network feature, and this is participation. So the participation coefficient for the center embedded object and subject modifying, which was statistically different from each other. And so what the participation coefficient tells you is how much, let me back up. So, no, I'm good. I'm like trying to get it straight in my head before I say it and make sure I don't say anything wrong. So what the participation coefficient does is it looks at the correlation between different networks. And in this case, she looked at the salience network, the language network, the default mode network, and a demand network. So these 4 different networks, and looked at those networks, how much they're correlated within the network versus between networks, with the idea that the higher the participation coefficient, the more that network is communicating with other networks and integrating that information. And the lower, the more they're sort of focused in on each other, and there's sort of network correlation is higher. And what you see here is that for the object modifying, there's more within network correlation than between network correlation. But for the subject modifying, there's more between network correlation as opposed to within network correlation. So you get different information from each of these different analyses. Then it becomes, how do you integrate all of that information to tell you what's going on within the language network? But it also, I think, questions what is the language network?
Charlene,
mhm,
I'm sorry, it's 2:50.
okay.
Could you
Yeah,
wrap up a little bit? Because some people would need to
I'm
leave.
done. So that was the last thing I really wanted to talk about. And so I think the way I just want to end this is just by saying, I agree with Broadman and others that, of course, the brain isn't equal potential. Yes, there's localization, or else there wouldn't be all of these cytoarchitectonically different regions. The real question is, what's localized? What function is localized, and how do you define function? And again, I just want to sort of end with, language is not special from the rest of cognition. It's part of cognition. And that's it. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Charlene. So I'll now stop the recording. So any questions? And I think you can just unmute yourself.